in the movement, as we called it, I was a big deal. I was a reverend in a racial holy war. Kids in Germany would sit around getting drunk talking about fights that I've been in. In real life, I'm an alcoholic high school dropout, working a menial minimum wage job. When people blame Jews for what's going wrong in their life, they're casting away their agency to actually address those problems. Anti-Semitism is the foundation of all violent extremism that threatens Western society.
And we're back for another episode of Standpoint. I'm Gabe Groisman. I'm here actually in New Orleans, or however you're supposed to say it, in Louisiana, for the Combat Anti-Semitism's Mayors Conference. Got over 150 mayors here for the weekend. I brought my camera, my microphones, expecting to talk to mayors, but I ran into my friend Arno Michaelis.
There you go.
Got it right. The guy I've become friends with over the last several years. He's an unlikely friend, you would think, but it's actually not the case. Let me frame this a little bit for everyone for a second before I introduce Arno. We're seeing a rise not just of anti-Semitism across the United States and across the world, but we're also seeing a rise of sort of the classic white supremacy, skinhead, neo-Nazi movements all over our country, not just in places where you would assume that they would be, but really everywhere. There's some incidents in the last several weeks, kids from affluent families, well-educated, leaning into sort of the white supremacy thing. And the rest of the free world, are left with our hands up in the air saying, wait, first of all, how did we get back here? But how are we supposed to deal with this? As many of us suffer from the desire to always do something. And I think that's a good thing to suffer from as opposed to sitting on our hands. And I'm one of those people for sure. But I really try to push back against the society we live in where when anything happens, everyone thinks they're an expert immediately, right? So we spoke about it a little before we got on the air. COVID hit, and everyone has their own opinion on COVID for sure. But I promise you, 99.9% of those people, a week before COVID hit, March 15th, a couple of years ago, I think that was the date, at least it hit us in South Florida. No one knew anything about airborne viruses, or even knew what COVID was before that, right? But people become experts immediately. It happens with Russia, it happens in Israel, it happens with every issue. People just want to have an instant opinion. But I push against that. I try to read, I try to meet with people and learn from people. And Arno is someone that can actually give us so much insight to all of our listeners. I urge everyone to really pay attention to this episode because Arno has lived with a foot on both sides. I think he's got the tats to show it. But for those of you who are just listening, go online, check out his tattoos. Pretty cool. Crazy history, though, behind them, which we'll get into. But Arno is a former skinhead, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, lived a significant portion of his life in that fashion, pulled out of that world. He will talk about that. And now he actually dedicates his life for a few things with Parents for Peace. He goes out and he speaks to kids to try to de-radicalize them and let him explain it in his own words and bring them back over. And then also to educate people like me and you guys listening about the movement and what we can learn from it. So I'm super pumped about this episode. Usually we talk politics and more politics. I think this one may or may not touch politics a little bit, but it's really more about understanding the growth of this movement, hearing Arno's story, learning from it, and what we can learn from his experiences today. So Arno, that was a long-winded way to say thank you for joining the podcast.
I really appreciate it, Gabe. You did a brilliant job, and I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, man. I wish first I had to change it to my suit for this evening's event. We're walking a Hawaiian-style T-shirt with the colorful tattoos.
New Orleans fabulous.
Yeah, New Orleans fabulous. For those who don't know it, if you're not from here, you don't say New Orleans. You say New Orleans.
It's all kind of droll.
It's all got to be one. So Arno, anyone who follows you online, and you should follow him online, by the way, you can give out your handles, but knows a little bit about your background. But why don't you tell those who've never heard of you, sort of who are you, how'd you get here?
Right on. Well, it's always been a challenge for me to give a one-word definition of who I am and what I do. I can't be like, I'm a doctor, I'm an engineer, I'm an attorney. So I describe myself as a storyteller. I really believe that stories are how human beings relate to the world around them. And I tell stories in the form of speaking. I've been a professional speaker since 2010, done it all over the world. I've written a couple books. And I'm a big fan of the mantra, fake it till you make it. And I decided to start calling myself a filmmaker until actually I was involved in a couple films, and I've done some filmmaking as well. All the storytelling I do is done with the intention to inspire people to see themselves in others and others in themselves. And it's informed by my past as a former white nationalist neo-Nazi skinhead from 1987 to 1994. I try to bring the lessons I learned, not only about the mistakes that led me into that story of my life, but more importantly, the really amazing things that happened to lead me out. And today I tell stories to the world, like you said, helping to guide young people primarily in a better direction, letting them know that hate sucks. It's an addiction and it destroys your life. While it might be a thrill at first, just like drinking tequila or shooting heroin, it very quickly can consume you and everything you do in your life and just corrupt it. So I want to get that message across to young people through storytelling, and also bring a broader message to people of all ages that as long as we maintain our faith in humanity and in each other, that's really the foundation defense against violent extremism as a whole, not only from neo-Nazis and white nationalists, but also from Islamists, from Antifa, from whatever kind of flavor you can think of.
So, first of all, I agree with everything except the heroin comment because never tried it, don't expect to. But the tequila, I get the real comment. Good call. Feels great in the morning, at night, but not so much in the morning. Exactly. But you grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right?
I did.
1987, you get pulled into the movement. Tell us a little bit about that. Help us explain how you got pulled into the movement and what that even means.
I've been doing the work I'm doing now since 2010, specifically the MLK holiday. That's when I went public with my story. So in January, it will be 16 years of doing this work internationally. And by this work, I mean countering violent extremism of all sorts. And in that space, I'm what's known as a former violent extremist. I have all sorts of friends who are formers. My good friend, colleague Mubin Shaikh will be here shortly if he's not here already. Mubin is a self-described former Muslim in terrorist clothing, or terrorist in Muslim clothing. Oh, he's going to kill me for getting that backward. But I mentioned other formers because I know all kinds of former white nationalists, all kinds of former jihadis. I have a dear friend in Denmark who's a former Antifa. Him and I would have killed each other 30 years ago, and now we're good friends. And in the majority of these formers' stories, if you're looking at their origin story, you're going to find what they call in mental health circles adverse childhood experiences. People coming from severe poverty, severe abuse, just the depths of suffering that are unimaginable at times. In my case, I'm a bit of an outlier because I had a fairly idyllic childhood. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I never went hungry. I never took a beating. My parents were together. They loved me very much. They let me know that all the time. But underneath this facade of normalcy, our family was really living beyond our means. And my dad's an alcoholic. And when I was young, he at times did more drinking than working. And that put a lot of pressure on my mom to keep the lights on and the bills paid in our nice house in a nice neighborhood. They were constantly fighting just verbally, but it got heated quite often. And seeing that stress my mother went through, and my dad was doing the best he can. My dad's an amazing man, and I admire him and love him deeply, and he's a huge supporter of mine now. So I never want this to come off like, oh, this is all my dad's fault. But it's really about how I interpreted seeing my mom stressed out as a kid. And instead of being a good kid and being like, hey, mom, I see you're having a hard time. I love you. How can I help? I just started to distance myself from her and from my dad, who loved me very much. And of course, as I distanced myself from the people who love me, my suffering grew worse. And I started lashing out at other kids. I started out as a bully on the school bus. I got a kick out of it. Like, not just a kick, but like a visceral thrill from seeing other kids terrified of me, parents terrified of me, teachers terrified of me. And that was the beginning of my addiction to antisocial behavior, which eventually, you talk about gateway drugs. My gateway drug was being a bully on the school bus. By the time I was 16 years old, it had snowballed into being addicted to hate. So I went from being a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard to breaking and entering to vandalism. I started drinking myself when I was 14. Alcoholism is a genetic disease as well as an environmental one. And so by the time I'm 16, I'm a full blown alcoholic. I I familiar with violence since I was a little kid. I've been wallowing in violence for most of my 16 years of life. Violence that I instigate, not violence directed against me. And hate was just another part of the rush. I grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee called Mequon. There was a lot of Jewish people in Mequon. In the 6th grade, I went to all sorts of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. I had a great time. I loved it. I was like stoked that I got invited to them all. Like I was one of the cool kids. And I had Jewish friends throughout my childhood. Um, when I was really young, it no longer exists because it's very politically incorrect now. But there was a thing like the Cub Scouts called Indian Guides that me and my dad would go to, and there's other dads and their kids. And one of the other dads of kids was Professor Stan Kaplan and his son Deep. And my dad and Stan were good buddies, and outside of Indian Guides, they would sit around and drink some scotch while me and Dean would play. I remember going through the thing I think every Goyish kid with a Jewish friend goes through, and Dean says, "Oh yeah, explain Hanukkah to me." Well, we get presents for 8 nights. You get presents for 8 nights? No way, that's awesome. And he's like, no, it's not. It's, those 8 nights don't always add up to even year one Christmas, so it's not as cool as you think. But I remember spinning the dreidel. I remember guilt. I was like totally cool with Jewish people throughout my entire life. But by the time I was 16, this addiction had reached the point where that rush of offending people and shocking people overpowered what I knew in my heart was the right way to behave. In the same way that we mentioned heroin earlier, I know people who are in recovery from heroin addiction who at times would prostitute themselves to get their drugs. And I know they didn't feel good about that, but they didn't care as long as they got their hit. That was how I would describe my relationship with the swastika. I knew why swastikas repulsed people. I wasn't ignorant to that, but I didn't care as long as I got that rush. And that's where I was when I was exposed to white nationalist ideology through white power skinhead music when I was 16 years old.
And with your work, well, let's talk about how you got out of the movement. So you sure a movement you said for was that 7 years?
7 years.
Right. So what pulled you out of the movement?
Well, I look forward to talking more about Parents for Peace later, but I'm going to mention it briefly now and just to say that Parents for Peace is, to my knowledge, one of the few organizations in the de-radicalization space that treats hate as an addiction. And when I want to explain how I got out, this is really critical because if you think about an AA meeting or an NA meeting, you'll see a room full of people who are all there together because they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. The addiction experience is exhaustion every waking moment of your life. Your entire life revolves around obtaining the substance you're addicted to, consuming it, dealing with whatever consequences there are, and then repeating the cycle. And that's how my addiction to hate went for 7 years. It was exhausting on all sorts of levels. And from the get-go, it was exhausting. It had built to greater and greater exhaustion over a 7 year span. There were times at the beginning, sometimes where as I hitting somebody, I would have this inner voice being like, what the hell's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? This person didn't even do anything to you. And I didn't have the courage to even acknowledge that voice, much less answer it. And so the constant suppression of my knowledge of how wrong I was deep inside where I was a soul of a person was exhausting. As a kid, I've always been really curious, and I love, from my earliest memories, TV, sports, film, music, all the pop culture stuff that we all kind of take for granted. And when you become a white nationalist, incidentally, this exact same process happens when you become a jihadi. All of those things are forbidden. They're all seen as Jewish propaganda. We used to say Zionist propaganda as well, by the way. Oh yeah, to corrupt the minds of white people to make them easier to oppress. If you were to talk to like a Hamas member or an ISIS member, they would say the exact same thing, except it was to corrupt the minds of the Ummah, of the Muslim people, to make them easier to oppress. And this was hard for me because I loved all those things. I loved the Green Bay Packers growing up. I'm from Wisconsin. I can't watch a Packer game when I'm a white power skinhead. that doing so would make me complicit in the destruction of my people by rooting for a football team. Beyond that,
Wait, just so I understand, is that because their philosophy, the ideology is that the Jews control somehow the entertainment industry, so we're feeding into that?
well, anything that comes, and mind you, this is pre-internet, so 1987. Anything that comes across the airwaves then, and I'm sure now white nationalists say like anything that comes across the internet is somehow controlled by Jews and guided by Jews, all going really connecting a couple dots back to the plagiarized hoax of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which came out in Russia in like 1905, and that was kind of the seminal anti-Semitic platform that gave root to all contemporary anti-Semitism. And incidentally, it was also like referenced by Hitler as he was the architect of the Holocaust, and it was also referenced in Stalin's pogroms of Jewish people. So not just Nazis, but communists as well drew from these lies in the Protocols of Zion that Jews control everything and they're sneaky and they control the banks and media and everything else. So that's why I can't watch a football game. Beyond that, when in 1992, a woman I was dating who later became the mother of my child, she was a skinhead for longer than I was, and she was getting really burnt out on it. And she would tell me like, "I just want to hang out with normal people. Like I'm so sick of this." And I'd be like, "You race traitor, you're defying our race." And so she would hang out with normal people, and doing so, she was exposed to Seinfeld. And she came up to me one day and she's like, "Arno, you gotta see this show. You're gonna love it." I'm like, "Yeah, what's the show called?" And she's like, "Seinfeld." Seinfeld, right? Excuse. She's like, "No, just watch one episode. Seriously, like you don't have to tell anybody. You'll love it." And I did watch one episode. It was season 2, episode 3, The Pony Remark, and I just fell in love with it. Like if as goyish as I am, I totally related to the quintessential Jewish humor created by Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David. And I love that show. It had made it really difficult for me to be an anti-Semite when on a weekly basis, and really on a daily basis, because as any Seinfeld fan knows, you don't go through a waking day without at least one, if not multiple Seinfeld references. And while most people would just get a chuckle when they're having a bowl of soup or they're at marble rye or there's a close talker or whatever, I would get that chuckle, but then again, that inner voice would be like, "Oh, well, what does Jerry Seinfeld get to live in your whiter and brighter world? And if he does, you think he's going to be very funny while you're murdering all the other Jews?" And the only like honest answer to that was that I was full of it, that this ideology I had assumed as my identity was hollow and false. And so daily Seinfeld references like help to tear down get the and really drive home the futility and stupidity of my anti-Semitism. So that was exhausting. But what was most exhausting was when people I claimed to hate, people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American, Latino, and Asian coworkers, treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but also when I needed it most. And in doing so, they demonstrated for me how a human being should treat another human being. And also, by the way, in doing so, they put themselves in a position of power because they were making me play by their rules instead of the opposite. When I was a skinhead, everything I did was meant to provoke hostility and hate and violence. And so when people hated me, and I know I'm a big, gnarly, scary looking dude, but I'm really uncoordinated. So even when I used to brawl all the time, like half the time I was getting my ass kicked as bad as to get other people up. I didn't always win. I lost a lot. But whether I lost or won the fight didn't matter. What mattered was that it devolved to violence. And that was my comfort zone. That's where I work. That's where I dictate the rules. But when people treated me with kindness, they're like, "No, I'm not playing by your rules. Let me show you how much better life is if you can move on from this nonsense you believe." And so this exhaustion built and built, driven home by all these different angles over a course of 7 years, to finally when I reached a point where I was looking for an excuse to leave. And I needed an excuse because I was leading a pretty drastic double life. In the movement, as we called it, I was a big deal. I was the lead singer of a white power death metal band. We had groupies. We were relative rock stars. We'd sold 20,000 CDs in the early 90s. I was a reverend in a racial holy war. Kids in Germany would sit around getting drunk talking about fights that I've been in. And so I had a lot of, albeit hollow, status in the movement. In real life, I'm an alcoholic high school dropout, working a menial minimum wage job. I'm too much of a drunk to keep my bills paid. I got to keep moving home back home to mom and dad's house. And I had a habit of drinking until I passed out and urinating all over myself. Like that was real life. And then here's this fake one. And it was a pretty imposing idea to give up all of this, to face the cold reality of this hole I had dug myself. And so what happened in 1994 was when my daughter was 18 months old, my girlfriend and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. And a couple months after that, after a concert my band had played, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight right after the concert. He was also in a band. He was also the lead singer. He had two young kids who grew up never knowing their dad because he was out doing stupid things and got himself killed. And by that time, I lost count how many friends had been incarcerated. So it finally hit me in 1994 that if I didn't leave, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. So that's when I walked away.
How old were you?
23.
Wow. So first of all, just one quick side note. Thank you for sharing all of that. Your favorite character was the soup Nazi?
Of course, I thought the soup Nazi was brilliant. Nowadays, one of my favorite episodes is the limo.
Oh yeah.
Where George is mistaken for this white nationalist movement. Uh, Honestly, my favorites, picking a favorite Seinfeld character is hard. I really love Uncle Leo.
Oh, nice.
I,
So tell me, when you were radicalized, you can use that term. Sure. When you were radicalized, it was really more, as I understand it, uh, you were brought into a social circle where you felt welcome. And
Right.
kind of they gave you tools aren't the right words, but they gave you things that you can use to deal with whatever perceived trauma you had, whether it was real or not, right? So that's like, "Okay, here's how you could deal with the world." Oh, I can't stop thinking of American History X as you were talking, right? The same type of discourse that you
It's a brilliant oil, right?
yeah. So and by the way, the opening scene where this man they curb stomp somebody, a woman, their jaw on the sidewalk. I must have been 15 when that movie came out, and I remember that, and I can't get out of my head even today. It's a 30 years later, yeah. Um, but today, so much of that's happening online. I feel like between the mid 90s and in the last 5 years, we really lived in the Jewish world. I call it a honeymoon period. It's not just about Jews, the white supremacy, but really there was sort of these sort of hateful movements existed, but they were really in the shadow, right, for a long time. In the last several years, we're seeing everything start exploding again, coming to the fore. These days, it's not just invited to a concert to hear music and so everyone's really nice to you and they say we suffer the same as you suffer and these guys are our problem. It's online and it's much easier to get on their phone and at home in their bedrooms, and they can find thousands of people that think like them or at least pretend to. First of all, were you surprised by sort of this new rise in white supremacy, neo-Nazi movement in America, and what do you attribute it to?
I sadly was not surprised because while I am a former racist, as in a former white nationalist, I'm also a former anti-racist. When I've had 3 stints in college. I've yet to complete a degree, but in my last stint at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, toward the end of it, after I had started really thinking about going public with my past, I took a class called Peace Education. And I'm thinking, like, this is cool. It's going to teach me how to be peaceful in society. We can help people get along. The class would have been better titled White People Suck 101 because the entire class was, and this is in the very early days when the concept of privilege and oppression was still really only in academia and not in our contemporary discourse. But I first learned all those things, and I read all the books, I wrote all the papers, I was completely into it. I'm like, yes, I'm confessing my privilege, and this all makes sense. And white people did all these horrible things, and only white people can fix it, which is, I can't think of any more white supremacists than to say something like that. But I was a proponent of this whole privilege oppression model. And then when I started really delving into my past and writing my book, as well as actually doing work in real life, helping people get out of the movement. I also worked with a lot of Afro-American kids in the inner city of Milwaukee, which is one of the roughest inner cities in the country. It actually, I'm ashamed to say that Milwaukee, Wisconsin is the worst place to be an Afro-American in the United States of America, according to all metrics of success in life. And I worked with those kids, and I saw that this whole privilege oppression model really didn't apply as well as these academics thought it did in their classrooms. And I started thinking back to my white power days, and I remembered how I recruited. I have an archetype called Joe Pissed Off White Kid. I was always looking for Joe Pissed Off White Kid. Incidentally, I still am. And I approach it in a very similar way, because the first step in connecting with Joe Pissed Off White Kid, whether I was a skinhead recruiting or someone working in de-radicalization, is to find out what that pain point is. But before I do that, there's two steps that I got to draw this kid through before I have any chance of making him into a white nationalist. First step is I have to get him to identify as white. That has to be his prime identity, and really the only identity that matters. In 1987, if I go to Joe Pissed Off White Kid, let's say his name's Joe Murphy, and I go, "Who are you, Joe?" He'd be like, "Well, I'm Joe Murphy. I'm American. My family's Irish. We're Catholic. My dad's in the Union. We vote Democrat." Like, he might have this whole long list of how he identifies himself before he even gets to, "Oh, and I'm white." And I would tell Joe, I'm like, "None of that matters. What matters is you are a white man, and you are white whether you like it or not, because the enemies of our people are going to brand you because of the color of your skin." We're all too familiar with Holocaust inversion, but white nationalists do the same thing with racism inversion, where they flip everything around that was done to black people and like pitch it as it's being done to white people. So I need Joe to identify as white is step one. Step two is I make him feel persecuted because of it. In the late 80s, a classic one we would use would be like, "Well, how come there's a black entertainment television and there's no white entertainment television?"
Right. Black History Month, but no white.
Exactly. The answer to that is, like, television has been white entertainment television from day one. History class has been white history month all year from day one. And with a willful myopia, we just brush all that aside and we find anything that we can possibly present as a double standard as evidence of how white people are being oppressed, white people are being marginalized. And in the late 80s, that was difficult to do, because there wasn't all of this, the critical race theory driven rhetoric and now policy in the prior presidential administration that you could easily point to. We had to kind of concoct it. But nowadays, sadly, and I'm happy to see that a lot of this is changing, but not only the US Department of Education, but like Fortune 500 businesses would be rounding up not just students and employees, but being like, "You're white and you're a black indigenous person of color and you're an oppressor and you're oppressed."
So you're saying that the rise of critical race theory and the division, the way that the people who hold that philosophy look at the world, whether it's white versus non-white, and the non-whites are the oppressed and the whites are the oppressors. We know Jews, when we talk about this, we've spoken about this before, are always on the wrong side of that, whether we're looked to be white or not white.
Right.
They're always going to be on the oppressor side. So that's not great. But you're saying it was almost as a response to the rise of that movement sparked a rise in the white supremacist movement.
Absolutely.
It kind of gave them fodder and wait,
Oh,
have to make the goal. It's everywhere.
It was gold.
And they not publish hate in the internet. Is it as bad as people think it is, as far as radicalizing people in that movement?
It is, and really the most insidious thing about it is, back in the day there was chat rooms and like just text-based only bulletin board things, and there's always been white nationalist presence in those places. It moved to social media. I know a guy in the UK, Ivan Humble, does amazing work now. He was radicalized in the English Defense League by making a comment about a story about terrorism on Facebook. He's like, "This is horrible. Something needs to do something about it." And shortly after, somebody swoops into his DMs, hey, I see you're concerned about this. You should come meet with us. We're going to do something about it. So that definitely happens, but that's like kind of Web 2.0. Nowadays, really, and it's perverted and disgusting, but a lot of this radicalization happens in video game platforms. In like Discord, which is a video game server where people can have chat rooms. Roblox is unbelievably saturated with not just white nationalists, but violent extremists of all sorts, as well as child predators. And
It's interesting to interject. I had heard recently, I won't mention who it's about, but they'll recognize it when they see it. But there's even one of the popular video games, the jailbreak to get to the next level. It's like pure white supremacy, racist, like straight stuff that comes out. And that's the code that gets you to the next level.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So people who want to jump to the last level of the game have to be exposed to all this crazy white supremacist, racist stuff. And so many kids do it just to get to the game.
Right.
But a lot of kids get swept. You can assume get swept into it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So tell me, because I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else. Sure, tell me about what you're doing now, and sort of what's working to pull people out of this. Right? I'm an optimist. I suffer my life being an optimist all the time. So we see all this negativity, but we have people like you going out there working, getting people out of that movement. So tell us what you're doing and what's working.
Absolutely. In addition to being a storyteller, and there's a lot of storytelling involved in this job description, I'm an exit peer specialist at Parents for Peace. Parents for Peace was founded in the mid 2000s by an Afro American family from Memphis, Tennessee, the Bledsoes. And their eldest son, Carlos, was radicalized into an Islamist group while he was in college. And he was actually planning on bombing a synagogue. And fortunately, the logistics and technical aspects of that fell through for him, Baruch Hashem. But as a kind of a plan B, he went and shot up a U.S. Army recruiting station and killed an officer. And Carlos will be in prison for the rest of his life. His father, Melvin, who passed away a few months ago, and we miss him, but we're carrying his work forward. His father, Melvin, and his sister, Monica, they were thinking like parents need some kind of resource to turn to when they begin to see signs of radicalization in their loved ones and their children that then help guide that person to a healthier path, and also to advise the family on how they can create an environment most conducive to that person's recovery. So that was the beginning of Parents for Peace. And in 2016, our executive director, Miriam Nadri Churchill, took over. One of the first things she did was reach out to me and my aforementioned associate, Mubin Shaikh. And Mubin and I were involved from the get-go on the advisory board of Parents for Peace, kind of giving advice to Miriam and helping her getting her helpline off the ground, which is a toll-free North America-wide helpline that a family can call if they need help. It's 844-49-PEACE. People can also go to parentsforpeace.org with the number 4, where the helpline's there, as well as our email address for help as well. And when somebody reaches out to us, a typical call is going to be like, well, little Johnny's in the basement all the time. He's on the internet 14 hours a day. He's talking about killing Jews. He's talking about blaming everything else on everybody, blaming all his problems on the rest of the world. And that's where we come in and assign an interventionist to that family. And the peer exit specialist comes in kind of according to what flavor of radicalization the individual of concern is under the influence of. So I take most of the white nationalist cases. Mubin takes most of the Islamist cases. We do a lot of cross work. I'll let Mubin come talk to my white nationalist kids. He'll let me come talk to his Islamist kids. Really, to a point that we make all the time is that really all violent extremism, if you have a Venn diagram, it all converges on anti-Semitism, which is why Parents for Peace is entirely focused on combating anti-Semitism. It's why we've done a lot of work with combat anti-Semitism movement, and we'll continue to, because anti-Semitism is the foundation of all violent extremism that threatens Western society. So if we can diminish anti-Semitism in our society, we're basically pulling the rug out from all of these violent extremist narratives of all different sorts that harm everyone. Here in New Orleans, just last New Year's, there was an ISIS attack where I was listening to music last night on Bourbon Street, and I think 13 people were killed. We know there's been also too many white nationalist attacks. So not only do these attacks threaten civil society in a larger sense, but it also, anti-Semitism harms the anti-Semite. And that's something a lot of people don't think of. I think we as a civil society need to be committed to diminishing and eventually ridding ourselves of anti-Semitism as a society. First of all, it's the right thing to do. Jewish people have contributed so much more to society over the past thousands of years that could be imagined considering the small fraction of society the population represents. And if we're talking about one of the smallest religious ethnic minorities on the planet who have been dealing with untold persecution and oppression for thousands of years, I think it's the least we could do to dedicate ourselves to advocating for them and protecting them and celebrating. So we're committed to that because that's part and parcel to our job to combat violent extremism in a broader sense. And when we work with these families, we see how a family where nobody's Jewish and they likely haven't met a Jewish person in their entire lives, but that entire family gets destroyed when their son comes under the influence of an anti-Semitic narrative and kills someone or goes to prison. And now this entire family is suffering because their loved one fell under the influence of an anti-Semitic narrative. In a best case scenario, where hopefully there's not a mass casualty event or someone going to prison, when people blame Jews for what's going wrong in their life, they're casting away their agency to actually address those problems. And go figure, the problems get worse and worse, and their life continues to spiral down the toilet. And according to this ideology that they're stricken with, it's not their fault their life's going down the toilet. It's the Jews' fault. And so in a best case scenario, they're going to have a dumpster fire of a life where they're constantly in a state of misery and anger and hatred, and they don't really understand what love is and what compassion and kindness is. And that to me is in a lot of ways as tragic as any other kind of outcome.
Arno, just share quickly your social media handles. I want people to be able to follow you online.
Awesome. People can find me on Instagram and LinkedIn at just at Arno Michaelis, ArnoMichaelis. Parents for Peace is at parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. And again, our hotline is 844-49-PEAC.
Oh, guys, thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. I think it's critical to sit down and listen to other people's perspectives. Arno, thank you so much for dedicating your life to try to bring people together, to try to bring people back from that negativity. You remind me a lot of someone I haven't seen in many years, Haras Rafiq. I don't know if you know him.
I'd love
The
to.
UK, he does something very similar with Muslim extremists in the UK. He's got a tough job. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Make sure to open up your conversations, invite people to your dinner tables, learn from them before you form your own opinions. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe and do all the great things you do to support podcasts, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, brother.